Sometimes the things we discard hold more worth than we know. And sometimes one act of mercy uncovers secrets buried in dust and time. At the Dry River livestock auction, a limping old donkey drew cruel laughter, worthless, they said, bound for the butcher. But when scarred cowboy Silas Ward raised his hand and offered his last coin, he saw something no one else noticed, a brand on the donkey's flank. The same mark he'd burned onto his daughter's pack animal years before, when a raid stole everything from him. What started as compassion became a doorway to the past. Silas believed, gone forever. Could saving one wounded animal lead him back to the daughter he'd mourned for years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Silas Ward hadn't always been a ghost. Once his voice carried across open country, guiding wagon trains through mountain passes and telling stories around campfires that made children laugh and adults lean closer. Once his hands held more than reins and tools. They held his wife's waist as they danced in the kitchen, his daughter's small fingers as she learned to walk. Once he was a man who belonged to the world, and the world belonged to him. That was before the fire. Before the screaming, before the silence that followed him like a shadow for 15 years. The Ward homestead sat in a valley 20 miles north of what would become Dry River, back when the territory was still wild enough that neighbors were measured in hours of hard riding rather than minutes of pleasant walking. Silas had built the cabin himself, logs chinked tight against winter winds, a stone fireplace that drew clean and windows facing east to catch the morning sun. Elena had sewn curtains from calico she'd carried all the way from her family's place in Tucson, and their daughter Sarah had planted wildflowers along the porch that first spring. Age 6, and determined to make everything beautiful, Elena Reyes Ward moved through that house like music, her long dark braids swaying as she worked, her laughter rising at Silas's dry observations about the mule's stubbornness, or the neighbor's peculiar habit of counting his chickens twice daily. She'd married Silas against her father's wishes. He'd wanted her to choose the merchant's son, the one with prospects and a store in town. But Eleanor saw something in the quiet trail scout that others missed. She saw integrity. She saw kindness. She saw a man who listened more than he spoke and meant every word he said. Their daughter inherited Elena's dark hair and quick smile, Silas's steady gray eyes and careful way of observing the world before acting. Sarah was 8 years old in the summer of 1878, small for her age, but fierce in her affections and loyalties. She followed Silas everywhere his work allowed, learning to read tracks in the dirt, to judge weather by the feel of the air, to move quietly through brush without disturbing the birds. He taught her patience, the value of watching and waiting, the importance of understanding a situation before making your move. "Papa," she'd say, crouched beside him as he examined hoofprints in dried mud. "How do you know it was 3 horses and not 4? "Count the patterns," he'd answer, pointing with a stick. "See how this one's gait is different. Front left favors outside. Now look, that same pattern appears 3 times in this stretch, but no 4th variation. 3 horses, one with an old injury." She'd nod, serious as a judge, memorizing everything. Elena would watch them from the porch, shaking her head with affection. "You're raising a scout, not a lady," she'd tease. "I'm raising Sarah," Silas would reply. "She'll decide what that means." His work took him away sometimes, 3 days here, a week there, leading groups through territory he knew like the lines of his own palm. He was respected among the wagon trains and trading expeditions, known for his reliability and his uncanny ability to find water where maps showed none, to navigate by stars and instinct when trails disappeared. They called him Silent Ward. Not because he never spoke, but because he chose his words with the same care he chose his routes, deliberately, economically, with purpose. But he always came home, always returned to the valley, to the cabin with the calico curtains, to Elena's cooking and Sarah's excited recounting of everything that had happened in his absence. The mule kicked the fence. A fox got 2 chickens. Mama taught her a new song. The ordinary miracles of family life, the kind that seem endless when you're living them and desperately finite when they're gone. The tin music box had been Sarah's 6th birthday gift, purchased from a traveling merchant at considerable expense, more than Silas could really afford. But Elena had convinced him with a look and the observation that childhood passes quickly. The box was small enough to fit in Sarah's palm, decorated with painted flowers, and when wound, it played a simple melody while a tiny horse figure spun in circles. Sarah treasured it absolutely, winding it each night before sleep, watching the horse dance in lamplight, while Eleanor sang softly and Silas sat nearby, mending tack or oiling his rifle. Those evenings existed in Silas's memory, with a clarity that 15 years hadn't dimmed. The golden light, the melody, Sarah's drowsy voice asking for one more story, Elena's hand on his shoulder as she passed behind his chair. Perfect and irretrievable, like looking through glass at something you can no longer touch. The Comanchero raid came on a September night when Silas was 4 days away, leading a supply train through the mountains to a mining camp. The raiders hit fast and brutal the way they always did, burning, taking, killing. Elena heard them coming and hid Sarah in the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, piling stored vegetables over the trap door before running outside to lead the raiders away from the house. It might have worked. It almost worked. But fire doesn't discriminate, and the cabin went up like kindling once the raiders touched torches to the roof. They took everything of value. Horses, the mule, 24 chickens in crates, tools, blankets, a few pieces of jewelry. They took Sarah from the root cellar, screaming for her mother. They left Elena's body in the yard where she'd fallen, 3 bullet wounds in her chest. And they left the burning cabin as a signal visible for miles. Another family destroyed. Another piece of civilization pushed back. Silas saw the smoke from 10 miles away. He abandoned the supply train and rode hard, his horse near collapse by the time he reached the valley. The cabin was ash and charred beams. Elena was already cold. Sarah was gone, along with every animal they owned. The other families in the region had seen the smoke too, but by the time they arrived it was far too late for rescue, only time for burial and helpless rage. They found the raiders' trail heading southwest, clear as a road in the dirt. Silas left Elena's grave with soil still fresh on his hands and followed that trail for 3 months straight. He barely ate. He didn't sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch. He tracked the Comancheros across 3 territories, through towns and wilderness, speaking to everyone, showing a small portrait he'd had made of Sarah the previous year, asking the same questions until his voice went hoarse. "Have you seen this girl? 8 years old, dark hair, grey eyes. Taken by raiders, please. Anything you remember. Some people helped. Most couldn't." The trail went cold in the Badlands west of Santa Fe, and Silas searched for 2 more months in expanding circles, desperate and increasingly unhinged. He got into fights. He made accusations. He threatened men who looked at him wrong. Eventually he collapsed outside a cantina and woke up 3 days later in a church, tended by nuns who spoke gently and fed him broth and told him the truth he couldn't accept. His daughter was gone. He returned to the valley that winter to find another family had claimed his land, legally, with papers, because he'd been declared dead and his property seized for back taxes. Elena's grave had a marker now, paid for by neighbors. Someone had placed wildflowers on it, dried by wind and sun. Silas stood there for an hour without moving, his face blank, his hands empty. The scars came later. He'd been working as a ranch hand south of Dry River when a barn fire broke out. Everyone ran from the building, but Silas heard a horse screaming inside. He went in, got the horse out, took a burning beam across his face and shoulder when the loft collapsed. The burns were severe enough that infection nearly killed him, and when he finally healed, the left side of his face was a mass of twisted tissue, his eye pulled slightly by the scar. His neck marked with rippled skin that never quite lost its reddish tint. The scars gave people permission to leave him alone, which is what he wanted. He drifted into Dry River and stayed because it was as good a place as any, remote enough that no one asked questions, small enough that work existed if you weren't particular about wages. He lived in a shack on the edge of town, one room with a stove and a cot, and took jobs that required more strength than sociability. Loading wagons, digging wells, clearing rocks from fields, work that exhausted the body and quieted the mind. Doc Merriweather remembered Silas from before, remembered Elena's laughter and Sarah's bright curiosity. He'd traveled through the valley once, treating Sarah for a fever that turned out to be nothing serious. Now he watched Silas move through town like a spectre and said nothing, because what was there to say? Some griefs are too large for words. Ruth Callahan ran the boarding house with efficiency and grace, a widow herself who understood something about loss. She'd lost her husband to a mining accident 5 years back, lost her son to cholera the year before that. She didn't pry into Silas's past, but she sometimes left a basket of food on his porch, covered with a cloth, no note attached. He never thanked her, but the baskets were always returned clean. Tom Bridger owned the auction house and had watched Silas attend the monthly sales for years now, never bidding, just standing at the back and watching animals trade hands. Tom had asked once early on if Silas was looking to buy. Just looking, Silas had replied, and Tom let it be. Some men came to auctions for business. Some came for the ritual of it, the reminder that life continued despite everything. The music box stayed in Silas's coat pocket, wrapped in a scrap of cloth. The mechanism had broken years ago. The horse no longer spun. The melody was silent, but he carried it anyway. Sometimes at night he'd take it out and hold it, remembering Sarah's face in lamplight, the way she'd hum along to the tune. The memory was torture and comfort in equal measure, the only proof he'd once been part of something larger than survival. 15 years. A daughter who'd be 23 now if she lived. Most likely she didn't. Most likely she'd died within weeks of being taken, used and discarded like trash. That was the reality of these raids, the truth everyone knew but rarely spoke. Children didn't survive captivity, not usually, not for long, but Silas had never found her body, never found confirmation, never found the closure that would let him stop carrying the music box, stop attending the auctions, stop waking each morning with the same question: is today the day I learn the truth? He'd given up hoping. Hope was a luxury for people with futures. But he'd never quite managed to give up existing, and existence meant routine. Wake at dawn, work until dark, attend the auction on the first Saturday, sleep, repeat. On this particular first Saturday of October in 1892, Silas stood at the back of the auction yard as he always did, watching horses and cattle parade through the ring. Tom Bridger called out prices in his steady voice. Bidders raised hands or called numbers. Animals sold or didn't. The wheel turned. Then they brought out the donkey and everything changed. The animal was old, clearly mistreated, limping badly on its front right leg. The crowd's laughter started immediately. This was the kind of animal you put down, not put up for sale. Tom looked embarrassed, but did his job, starting the bidding at $5. No one moved. He dropped to $3. Still nothing. "Come on, folks," Tom said. "Someone must need a pack animal. Need a bullet more than a buyer," someone shouted, and the laughter rose again. Silas barely heard them. He was staring at the donkey's flank, at a mark partially obscured by dirt and matted hair. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring protests, until he stood at the ring's edge. The donkey turned slightly and the mark became clear, an SW brand. His brand, the exact pattern he'd used on his own livestock 15 years ago, distinctive in its spacing and the slight curl on the W's tail. His hand rose before he'd consciously decided to move. His voice, rusty from disuse, called out, $10. The crowd went silent. Tom blinked. "Silas? You're bidding?" $10, Silas repeated. "Sold," Tom said quickly, before anyone could question the moment further. Silas reached into his pocket and counted out coins, his last money, until next week's wages, and handed them to Tom. Then he entered the ring and took the donkey's rope. The animal looked at him with dark, liquid eyes that seemed almost relieved. "Come on," Silas said quietly. "Let's get you out of here." As he led the donkey away from the crowd, his hand touched the music box in his pocket, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt something shift in his chest. Not hope. He didn't trust hope, but possibility. The smallest possibility that maybe, just maybe, his searching wasn't over. The crowd dispersed slowly, muttering about the spectacle of Silas Ward finally speaking, finally bidding, finally doing something other than haunt the edges of their gatherings. Silas ignored them all, his entire focus on the donkey limping beside him. He led the animal to a shaded area behind the auction house, where a water trough sat beneath a cottonwood tree. The donkey drank deeply while Silas ran his hands over the branded area, brushing away accumulated grime. There was no question. This was his mark, applied exactly as he'd done it 15 years ago. The iron had been custom-made by a blacksmith in Tucson. Wedding gift from Elena's father, who disapproved of the marriage, but couldn't quite bring himself to send his daughter into frontier life without some practical assistance. Silas had used that brand on their horses, the mule, and on Sarah's pack animal, a young donkey she'd named Patches for the irregular coloring on his haunches. This animal was too old to be Patches. That donkey would have been barely weaned when taken. But the brand connected them somehow, tied this creature to that vanished time. Silas's hands continued their examination, checking the donkey's injuries, assessing the severity of the limp. The front right leg showed old damage, possibly a break that had healed poorly, leaving the joint swollen and movement restricted. The animal was malnourished but not starving, coat rough but not disease-ridden. Someone had kept it alive but hadn't cared for it properly. Then his fingers found the halter, still fastened beneath the rope halter Tom had added for the auction. This one was older, cracked leather that had once been oiled to suppleness, but was now stiff with age and weather. Silas worked at the buckle, loosening it carefully so he could slip the halter free and examine it properly. His breath caught. The leather work was unmistakable. Tooled patterns he'd created himself, decorative but also identifying. He'd made this halter 8 years after Sarah was taken, made it during a period when he'd briefly convinced himself she might still be alive, might return somehow. He'd crafted it for her 10th birthday, even though she wasn't there to receive it. He'd finished it, oiled it, hung it in his shack, and eventually packed it away, because looking at it hurt too much. This wasn't that halter. This was a copy, no, not a copy. This was the same pattern, the same technique, but executed by different hands. Someone had seen his work and replicated it, or someone had taught the pattern to another craftsman, or the possibility hit him like a physical blow. Someone had received the original halter. Someone had used it as a template. Someone had cared enough to reproduce it. Sarah. Silas's legs gave out. He sat hard in the dirt, the halter clutched in both hands, his vision blurring. For the first time in 15 years, tears came. Not the dry, burning grief that had hollowed him out in the early days, but wet, helpless tears that he couldn't control or stop. The donkey nuzzled his shoulder gently, a gesture so kind it nearly broke him completely. "Silas!" Doc Merriweather's voice came from nearby, concerned and careful. "Son, what's wrong?" Silas couldn't speak. He held up the halter with shaking hands. Doc approached slowly, as one might approach a spooked horse. He was in his 70s now, white-haired and stooped, but his eyes were sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He took the halter, examined it closely, looked at the brand on the donkey, then back at Silas. "This your work?" Doc asked quietly. Silas managed a nod. "From before." Another nod. Doc studied the halter again, turning it to see every angle. "Someone made this after you did. Same style but different hands. You can see it in the tooling. Good work, but not quite yours. Learned from yours, maybe." "Sarah," Silas choked out, his voice breaking on her name. Doc's expression shifted, understanding mixing with caution. "You think your daughter made this?" "Someone who learned from my work. Someone who had the original. Someone who—" Silas couldn't finish. The implications were too large, too fragile, too terrifying to speak aloud. If Sarah had received the original halter, she'd lived at least until age 10. If she'd learned the craft or taught it to someone else, she'd lived longer still. If this halter was on this donkey now, then— "Tom!" Doc called, and the auction house owner appeared from around the corner, ledger in hand. "You got records on this animal? Where it came from?" Tom consulted his book, flipping pages. "Estate sale. Kellerman Ranch, south of Socorro. Old man died 6 months back, no heirs, property liquidated." He looked at Silas with something like pity. "That help? Socorro, New Mexico territory." Silas had searched there in the early days, found nothing, moved on. But 15 years ago, it had been a brief stop, a few days of asking questions that led nowhere. He'd never heard of Kellerman Ranch specifically. "When did the animal arrive here?" Doc pressed. 2 weeks back. Came with a mixed lot. 3 horses, some chickens, this donkey. Ranch was 40 miles from Socorro proper, up in the hills. Rough country. Silas found his voice again. "The ranch took in strays? Problem animals?" Tom shrugged. "Possible. I don't know the history, just the inventory. Who would know?" Silas stood unsteady but determined. "Widow in town might remember," Tom offered. "Mrs. Chen. She did laundry for half the ranches in that region, traveled around. If there were rumors or stories about Kellerman's place, she'd have heard them." Doc put a hand on Silas's arm. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking this donkey came from somewhere. Wore a halter made by someone who learned from my work. Was marked with my brand." Silas's voice grew stronger. "I'm thinking my daughter didn't die immediately. She lived. Maybe she still lives." "Silas," Doc's tone carried warning. "That's a long string of maybes. Don't tear yourself apart over, I have to know." Silas looked at the older man directly. 15 years I've lived without knowing. If there's even a chance, even the smallest possibility." Doc held his gaze, then nodded slowly. "All right, but promise me you'll be careful. Hope can be as dangerous as despair." "I stopped hoping years ago," Silas replied. "This isn't hope. This is following a trail." Ruth Callahan appeared then, drawn by the commotion. She took one look at Silas's face, the halter in his hands, the tears drying on his scarred cheeks, and understood immediately that something fundamental had shifted. "What do you need?" she asked simply. The question was so direct, so kind, that Silas nearly broke again. "Supplies. For a journey. I can pay you back. You can pay me back by finding what you're looking for," Ruth interrupted. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Take it. Call it an investment in the outcome we're all hoping for." Silas accepted the pouch, feeling its weight. Enough for supplies, probably a bit more. He looked at these 3 people, Doc, Ruth, Tom, who'd watched him exist in their periphery for years and were now stepping forward without hesitation. "Thank you," he managed. "Bring her home," Ruth said quietly. "If she's out there, bring her home." That evening, Silas worked in the small corral behind his shack, tending to the donkey's injuries with borrowed salve and clean bandages. The animal stood patiently, trusting the stranger's gentle hands. As darkness fell, Silas found himself talking, not to another person but to the donkey, words spilling out after years of silence. "You knew her, didn't you?" His voice was rough. "You were there. You remember." He stroked the animal's neck. "I'll call you Echo, because you're an echo of the past, calling me forward." Echo huffed softly as if in agreement. Silas studied the halter again by lamplight, memorizing every stitch, every tool mark. Someone's hands had made this. Someone who'd been taught or who'd learned by observation. Someone connected to Sarah, to him, to the life that had been stolen. He pulled the music box from his pocket, set it beside the halter. 2 artifacts of loss. 2 promises unfulfilled. The box was broken, silent, but the halter was whole, functional, real. "Let her be alive," Silas whispered into the darkness. Not a prayer exactly, he'd given up on God years ago, but something close to it. A plea to whatever forces might govern chance and fate. "Let her be alive." Echo dozed in the corner. Stars emerged overhead. Somewhere to the south, answers waited, or another dead end. But for the first time in 15 years, Silas Ward felt something other than emptiness. He felt ready to move. Dawn came cold and clear. Silas loaded his few possessions onto Echo's back. Bedroll, canteen, the supplies Ruth had made possible, his rifle wrapped in oilcloth. The donkey accepted the weight without complaint, standing steady despite the injured leg. They left Dry River as the sun broke over the eastern hills, their shadows stretching long before them. The journey south required 3 days minimum, longer if they accommodated Echo's limp. Silas chose longer. 15 years he'd waited. A few extra days wouldn't matter if they kept Echo sound enough to complete the journey. He set an easy pace, stopping frequently to rest the animal, checking the bandaged leg each evening to ensure the swelling wasn't worsening. The first night's camp was near a dried creek bed, cottonwoods providing shelter from the wind. Silas built a small fire and sat studying his old trail map, the one he'd marked 15 years ago with routes searched, witnesses interviewed, leads that went nowhere. The paper was creased and faded, stained with dirt and water, a chronicle of failure. He traced one route with his finger, remembering. He'd followed this path for 3 weeks, chasing a rumor about a dark-haired girl seen with traders. Found her eventually, wrong child, someone else's tragedy. The girl's mother had been so grateful someone cared enough to check. Silas had felt nothing but disappointment, which shamed him even in memory. That was the worst part, he said aloud, addressing Echo as much as himself. Not the dead ends, the times I hoped and was wrong. Each one was like losing her again. Echo raised his head from grazing, ears forward, listening. There was one time, Silas continued, surprised by how easily the words came after years of silence. I found a body, girl about Sarah's age, dark hair. Been dead maybe a month, left in an arroyo like she didn't matter. He paused, the memory raw despite time's passage. Had to look at her face to be sure. Had to see if it was my daughter. And when it wasn't, when I felt relieved that some other man's child was dead, I hated myself. The stars overhead were the same stars that had watched those desperate searches, indifferent witnesses to human suffering. Silas had stopped seeing beauty in them years ago, but tonight they seemed less hostile, just distant, just burning. You remember her, don't you, boy? He reached out to stroke Echo's neck. You must have been young then, when she knew you. Maybe not much more than a colt. Did she take care of you? Did she talk to you like I'm talking to you now? Echo's dark eyes reflected firelight. Unreadable, but somehow comprehending. The second day brought them through familiar territory, land Silas had covered in those frantic early weeks. A burned-out homestead sat just off the trail, walls collapsed, roof gone, everything reclaimed by sage and sun. He'd stopped here once before, hoping for information. The family had been gone months by then, moved on or dead. He stopped again now, watering Echo at a nearby creek while memories surfaced unbidden. The panic of those early days, the way he'd pushed himself and his horse past reasonable endurance, the certainty that if he just searched harder, rode faster, asked more questions, he'd find her. The desperate arithmetic of thinking that speed equaled salvation, that desperation could substitute for strategy. He'd been wrong. Panic had made him careless, had caused him to miss details, to push past people who might have helped because he was too focused on forward motion to stop and truly listen. Now older and broken in different ways, he understood that some journeys can't be rushed. Some truths only reveal themselves to patience. Maybe that's all any of us can do, he said to Echo as they rested in the shade. Keep walking. Keep breathing. Keep trying even when it feels pointless. The donkey seemed to agree, munching grass with contented persistence. Evening of the second day found them approaching a small settlement, Tres Cruces. 3 buildings clustered around a crossroads, barely worthy of the name town, a cantina, a dry goods store, a stable. Silas remembered passing through years ago, finding nothing useful. But time changed things. People remembered differently with distance. It was worth checking. The cantina's interior was dim and cool, empty except for the bartender, a middle-aged man with graying hair and careful eyes. He looked up as Silas entered, his expression neutral, until recognition dawned. You're the man who lost his daughter, Miguel Santos said. It wasn't a question. Still searching? The fact that Miguel remembered, that the tragedy had marked him enough to be recognizable 15 years later, said something about the depths of what had been lost. Silas nodded, approaching the bar. I have new information, he said, pulling out the halter. Someone made this. Use my technique. The pattern I taught. He stopped, correcting himself. The pattern Sarah might have learned. Miguel examined the halter with respect, turning it to see the tooling clearly. Good work. Careful hands made this. It was on a donkey from Kellerman Ranch, near Socorro. Kellerman. Miguel's expression shifted, became guarded. I know the place. Old man took in strays, animals, people, didn't much discriminate. Kept to himself mostly. Did he take in children? From raids. Miguel set the halter down carefully. That was the rumor. Never proven. Kellerman would show up at auctions with kids sometimes, claim they were orphans he'd placed with families. No one asked too many questions. Times were hard. Orphans were common. But you had suspicions. Everyone had suspicions. But suspicions aren't evidence, and Kellerman was respected enough that no one pushed. Miguel poured water from a clay pitcher into a cup, slid it toward Silas. His widow might know more. She worked at the church in Socorro, helping with orphans. Blas called Misión de Nuestra Señora del Socorro. The word orphans landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward through Silas's chest. Sarah could have been processed as an orphan, recorded, placed, given to a family. She could have grown up thinking her parents were dead, thinking no one was looking for her. Is the widow still there? Silas asked, his voice tight. Far as I know, woman named Amelia. Good soul by all accounts. If anyone knows where those children ended up, it would be her. Silas drained the water, set down one of his precious few coins. Thank you. Find your daughter, Miguel said as Silas turned to leave. But be ready, 15 years is a long time. She might not be the child you remember. Neither am I, Silas replied. The third day stretched before them, miles falling away beneath Echo's steady if uneven gait. Silas found his thoughts circling the same questions like buzzards over carrion. What if Sarah was alive but didn't remember him? What if she did remember but blamed him for not protecting her? What if she'd built a new life and his return would only bring pain? What if? He forced the thoughts aside. Speculation was pointless. Only facts mattered. The brand, the halter, the trail leading to Socorro. He would follow it as far as it went. He would find the truth, whatever it was. And then he didn't know. But not knowing had never stopped him before. Late afternoon brought Socorro into view, buildings emerging from heat shimmer on the horizon. The town was larger than Dry River, more established, with actual streets and a plaza. Church bells marked the hour. Smoke rose from chimneys and smithy forges. Life continued here, busy and heedless of one man's desperate mission. Silas dismounted at the edge of town, his legs stiff from days in the saddle. He stood beside Echo, one hand on the donkey's shoulder, gathering courage for what came next. We've come this far, he said quietly. Can't turn back now. Echo huffed agreement, and together they walked into Socorro, carrying the weight of 15 years and the fragile possibility of answers. Socorro's stable owner looked at Echo with the expression of a man asked to care for the already dead. That animal won't last another month, he said flatly. Just needs rest and good feed, Silas replied, counting out coins he couldn't spare. I'll pay extra for gentle treatment. The man's skepticism didn't fade, but money spoke louder than opinion. He took Echo's lead rope. 3 days paid. After that, you're on your own. 3 days would have to be enough. The Misión de Nuestra Señora del Socorro stood at the town's north edge. White adobe walls bright against the afternoon sun, bells silent in the tower. Silas approached with his hat in his hands, conscious of his scarred face, his trail-worn clothes, the way he must look to respectable people, like trouble, like someone to avoid. The priest who answered his knock was elderly, bent with years but sharp-eyed. I'm Father Domingo. How may I help you? Silas explained, briefly, carefully, watching the priest's face for reaction. He showed the halter, mentioned Kellerman Ranch, spoke his daughter's name for the first time in 15 years to a stranger. Sarah Ward, 8 years old when taken. She'd be 23 now if she lives. Father Domingo's expression was kind, but guarded. Many children came through here over the years. I cannot remember them all. The Kellerman widow, Amelia. I was told she worked here helping orphans. Something flickered in the priest's eyes. Recognition. or perhaps discomfort. Mrs. Kellerman passed 2 years ago. I'm sorry. Another door closed, another witness gone. Silas felt the familiar weight of dead ends settling across his shoulders, but he pressed forward. Your parish would have records. Children placed with families, names, dates. Could I see them? Father Domingo hesitated. These are private records. Family matters. I'm looking for my daughter, Silas said, his voice low but steady. Private doesn't apply when a father searches for stolen family. The priest studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Come. The church's back room smelled of candle wax and old paper. Father Domingo retrieved a leather-bound registry from a cabinet, set it on a wooden table, opened it to reveal pages of careful script, names, dates, brief descriptions of placements. Silas searched methodically, working backward from the present, his finger tracking down columns. Maria Garcia, placed with family in Albuquerque, 1891. Jose Martinez, placed with rancher outside Santa Fe. 1890, Ana Rodriguez, placed with widow in Socorro. 1889, name after name after name, each one representing a child without parents, a family broken by disease or violence or simple bad fortune. He reached the years around Sarah's disappearance. 1878, 1879, 1880, and his pulse quickened. More names here, the years following Apache campaigns, producing steady streams of orphans. But the pages weren't consecutive. Between March 1878 and January 1880, nothing. Clean edges where pages should be, but weren't. Pages are missing, Silas said, looking up at Father Domingo. Someone removed them. The priest came to look, his face troubled. I didn't know. When I arrived here 8 years ago, the registry was already in this condition. Who kept it before you? Father Mateo. He served this parish for 30 years before his death. Father Domingo paused. There were rumors he burned certain records before dying, but I never knew what or why. Silas felt his jaw tighten. Someone didn't want these children traced, or protected their privacy, Father Domingo suggested. But his tone lacked conviction, or sold them, Silas countered. The ugly truth sitting heavy between them. And didn't want evidence. The priest didn't argue. He looked sad and old, and burdened by knowledge he couldn't share or couldn't prove. Some stones are better left unturned, he said quietly. I've lived under that stone for 15 years, Silas replied. It's time to turn it. Father Domingo sighed. If you want to know more about Kellerman's operations, talk to Sheriff Pritchard. He was here during those years. He'd have seen what I only inherited stories about. The sheriff's office occupied a small building near the plaza, American flag hanging limp in the still air. Sheriff Amos Pritchard was a weathered man in his 60s, the kind of lawman who'd seen too much to be easily shocked, but retained enough idealism to keep trying. He looked up from paperwork as Silas entered, recognition immediate. Your ward, heard you were asking around. News traveled fast in small towns. Silas didn't waste time with pleasantries. Kellerman Ranch, you knew what was happening there. Pritchard leaned back in his chair, measuring his words. I knew Kellerman helped children, took in strays from raids, placed them with families looking for help. Nothing illegal about that. Nothing proven illegal, Silas corrected. But you had suspicions. The sheriff's silence was answer enough. How many children came through his ranch? Dozens, maybe more. Over 20 years, probably close to 100. The number staggered Silas. 100 children stolen from families, processed through Kellerman's ranch like livestock through an auction. And no one stopped it? Stopped what? Pritchard spread his hands. Children needed homes. Families needed help. Kellerman provided a service. Was it always clean? Probably not. But proving trafficking requires evidence, and evidence disappeared faster than I could gather it. The parish records, those and more. Bills of sale, correspondence, witness statements that never quite materialized when needed. Pritchard's expression hardened. Someone had money and connections. Someone made sure the operation stayed protected. Someone like who? If I knew that for certain, I'd have acted years ago. The sheriff pulled out a map, spread it across his desk, pointed to a spot in the hills south of Socorro. Kellerman Ranch, Estates abandoned now, picked over by scavengers. You won't find much. I'll find something, Silas said, with more confidence than he felt. Maybe. Pritchard folded the map. But Ward? Be careful. Kellerman's dead, but whatever system he was part of might not be. You start asking too many questions, you might find answers you can't handle. That evening, Silas sat in a rented room above a boarding house, the cheapest accommodation he could find. He laid out his artifacts, the halter, the music box, the map to Kellerman Ranch, evidence and talismans, proof and hope, all mixed together in a way that made his chest tight. Sarah had been at that ranch. The halter proved it. The missing record suggested someone wanted her presence hidden. But why? What had made his daughter different from the other dozens of children processed through Kellerman's operation? Or maybe nothing had. Maybe she'd been just one more item in an inventory, one more piece of merchandise, one more child whose family's love meant nothing against profit and opportunity. The thought made him physically ill. He crossed to the window, stared out at Socorro's darkening streets, and let the rage build. Not the wild, destructive rage of his early days, but something colder and more dangerous. The rage of a man who'd learned patience, who'd learned to wait, who'd learned that justice sometimes required the long pursuit. "I'm close," he said to the empty room. "I can feel it. Tomorrow he'd ride to Kellerman Ranch. Tomorrow he'd search every inch of that property until he found something, anything that would tell him where his daughter had gone, and then he'd follow that trail too. As far as it led, the music box sat on the small table, still silent, still broken. But tomorrow, maybe tomorrow, he'd find another piece of the puzzle. Another step closer to the truth. He had to believe that. Because without that belief, he had nothing left. Dawn light found Silas already riding, Echo's pace steady despite the lingering limp. The 5 miles to Kellerman Ranch passed through rolling hills, studded with pinon and juniper, land that could support cattle if managed right, but showed signs of neglect now. Fences sagged. Water troughs sat dry and cracked. The silence felt heavy, like even the birds had abandoned this place. The ranch buildings appeared around midday, a main house, barn, corral, bunkhouse, all in various states of collapse. The estate sale had stripped everything portable, leaving behind only bones. Silas dismounted, secured Echo in shade with access to scraggly grass, and approached on foot. The main house stood 2 stories, adobe and timber construction that had once been substantial. Now the roof sagged, windows gaped empty of glass. The front door hung askew on broken hinges. Silas entered cautiously, watching for weak floors and structural damage. Inside, dust covered everything. The furniture was gone, but impressions remained. Squares in the dust where tables had stood, rectangles where cabinets had rested against walls. The kitchen showed signs of family life. Hooks where pots had hung, a rusted stove, shelves that had once held dishes. In the corner sat a small chair, child-sized, forgotten, or deemed unworthy of taking. Silas picked up the chair, felt its weight. Sarah could have sat here, could have eaten meals at a table that no longer existed, in a household that had used her labor without caring about her loss. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms. 2 large, 1 small. The small room's doorframe bore scratches, marks measuring children's heights, multiple sets climbing the wood. Someone had tracked growth here, documented the physical progress of young bodies. But there were no names, no dates that helped. Just anonymous lines, representing anonymous children passing through. Silas descended the stairs, left the house. The barn called to him. That's where livestock would have been kept, where Echo might have lived, where Sarah would have worked. The structure was larger than the house, built to accommodate significant numbers of animals. The roof was mostly intact, though missing shingles let sunlight stream through in dusty columns. Old stalls lined both sides, hayloft accessible by a ladder with missing rungs. The smell of aged manure and hay lingered despite years of abandonment. Echo followed Silas inside, suddenly agitated, ears back, nostrils flaring, hooves dancing nervously on the packed earth floor. "You remember this place?" Silas said, recognition dawning. "This is where you lived." The donkey moved to a particular stall, sniffed the wood, then backed away with what seemed like recognition or perhaps bad memories. Silas approached the stall, examining it closely. The boards were weathered but sound, showing marks where an animal had rubbed against them repeatedly over time. Then he saw it, carved into the support beam at roughly shoulder height for a child, almost hidden by shadows and age. A rough S, and below it, numbers. 1879. Silas's vision blurred. His hand reached out, trembling, to trace the carving. Sarah's initial. The year after she was taken. Proof she'd been here alive, conscious enough to mark her presence. 9 years old, and leaving evidence that she existed, that she mattered, that someone someday might come looking. He pressed his forehead against the beam, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She'd been here. His daughter had stood in this spot, probably while caring for animals, and carved her name into permanence. A claim of identity in a place that tried to erase such things. "I found you," he whispered to the empty barn. "I found your mark, baby girl. I know you were here." But the carving raised as many questions as it answered. The year 1879 meant she'd been at the ranch at least a year after being taken. How long had she stayed? When had she left? Where had she gone? Silas searched the barn with renewed intensity, examining every beam, every board, every corner where evidence might hide. The tack room yielded dusty shelves, mostly empty now, a few scraps of rope, broken tools deemed unworthy of salvaging, and on one shelf papers, bills of sale for livestock yellowed with age. He sorted through them methodically. Horses sold to ranchers in 3 territories. Cattle purchased from auctions in Santa Fe. Chickens bought by the dozen. And there, a bill for a burro, branded SWW, purchased from an estate auction in Santa Fe 5 years ago, the trail before Kellerman. The animal had come from somewhere else, passed through other hands, eventually ended up here. But that bill was 5 years old. Echo must have been at Kellerman Ranch for years before being sold with the estate. And still no record of Sarah. No mention of children at all in these business documents. As if they'd been invisible. As if they'd never existed. Silas spent the afternoon searching the remaining buildings. The bunkhouse showed signs of hired hands. Rough bunks, personal items too worn to take. Nothing helpful. The old well was dry, revealing nothing but darkness when he peered into its depths. Every building, every corner, every possible hiding place yielded the same result. Silence. He returned to the barn as sunlight began its descent, sat beneath Sarah's carving, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd found and what remained missing. She'd been alive at 9. The halter suggested she'd lived longer, long enough to learn leatherwork or teach it. But past that, nothing. The trail disappeared again, just as it had 15 years ago. "Tell me where you went," he said to the carving, to the absent daughter, to the universe that seemed determined to withhold answers. "Tell me how to find you." The barn offered no response except silence and dust motes dancing in fading light. As evening settled, Silas rode back towards Socorro, his mind working through possibilities. Estate sales would have records, who bought what, who sold it, where things went. Someone in town would remember Kellerman's associates, his employees, the people who came and went from this ranch. Information existed. It was just a matter of finding who held it. The land office seemed the logical start. Deeds, sales, property transfers. But it was too late now. Offices closed for the day. Tomorrow. He'd start tomorrow. Socorro's streets were quiet as he returned Echo to the stable. The donkey went willingly now, tired from the day's ride. Silas paid for another day's care, received a grudging nod from the stable owner, who seemed surprised Echo was still alive. Back in his rented room, Silas pulled out the trail map and marked Kellerman Ranch with a notation. "Sarah here, 1879, carved initial in barn, evidence documented." The list of confirmed facts growing, even if the gaps remained vast. He studied the map as darkness fell outside his window. Somewhere between this ranch and the present day, his daughter existed, or had existed. The carving proved she'd survived the immediate aftermath of the raid. The halter suggested she'd lived years longer, but where was she now? Alive, dead? Trapped somewhere still waiting for rescue? The questions would drive him mad if he let them. Instead, he focused on what he could control: tomorrow's search, the next lead, the patient accumulation of facts. One step, then another still. He'd found her mark. Now he had to find her. The Socorro land office occupied a narrow building wedged between a mercantile and a boarding house. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Silas arrived as the clerk was unlocking the door. A bored-looking man in his 30s who regarded the early visitor with minimal interest. "Help you?" Henry Stills asked, not quite hiding a yawn. "Kellerman Ranch records," Silas said. "Employment history, estate papers, anything you have." Stills disappeared into the back room, returning 5 minutes later empty-handed. "Fire last year took most of the old records. Real tragedy. Lost decades of documentation. Another convenient fire. Another convenient loss of evidence." Silas kept his expression neutral, but inside the pattern was clear. Someone had systematically destroyed trails that might lead to uncomfortable truths. Who would remember the ranch? Employees, neighbors, people who did business there? Stills scratched his chin, thinking. Mrs. Chen might. She provided laundry services to most of the ranches in the region, traveled around regular. Chinese lady lives on the edge of town in a small place. If there were rumors or stories about Kellerman's operation, she'd have heard them. Silas got directions: a house on the southern edge, near where the town dissolved into open land. He walked there slowly, Echo trailing behind, both of them tired from yesterday's exertion. The sun was already hot, promising another scorching afternoon. Mrs. Chen's home was modest, single-room adobe with a small garden out front where vegetables grew in neat rows. She was elderly, perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back severely and hands gnarled from decades of hard work. She emerged at Silas's approach, her expression cautious. "Mrs. Chen, I'm looking for information about Kellerman Ranch." Her eyes narrowed. "Why?" Silas pulled out the halter, held it where she could see. "My daughter was taken 15 years ago. This halter was hers. It was on a donkey from that ranch. I think she was there. I need to know what happened to her." Mrs. Chen studied him for a long moment, then glanced at Echo, recognition flickering across her face. "That donkey. I remember that donkey." Hope flared in Silas's chest. "You saw him at the ranch?" "For years. Belonged to the girl. The quiet one with sad eyes." Mrs. Chen's expression softened. "Come inside. This is not a conversation for the street." Her home's interior was simple but immaculately clean. She offered tea, which Silas accepted more from politeness than desire. They sat at a small table while she gathered her thoughts. "The quiet girl," she began. "She arrived in late 1878, maybe 8 years old. Very frightened, nightmares, flinched at loud sounds." "Sarah," Silas whispered. "Her name is Sarah," Mrs. Chen nodded. "She never said her name to me. Mrs. Kellerman called her the Ward girl sometimes. I thought it was strange. Usually they used first names only, so the Kellermans had known who she was. Had known her family name. Had known and kept her anyway." "She worked in the house," Mrs. Chen continued. "Helped with cooking, cleaning. Mrs. Kellerman took interest in her, taught her skills." Sarah responded slowly. 4 years she lived there. I watched her grow from terrified child to capable young woman. What happened when she was 12? Mrs. Chen's face darkened. A man came, well-dressed from back east. "Looking for domestic help," he said. Mr. Kellerman negotiated. $300! A placement fee. The words hung in the air, ugly and clear. Silas felt his hands clench into fists. She was sold. Yes. Mrs. Chen rose, crossed to a small chest in the corner, retrieved a folded paper. "I kept this. I knew someday someone might come looking." She handed him the document. His hand shook as he unfolded it, an official-looking promissory note, dated 1882, bearing letterhead from a Denver firm. The text was businesslike, cold. Sarah Ward, domestic service. Age 12. Below it a partially legible signature, J. Beaumont, and an address in Denver. She didn't want to go, Mrs. Chen said quietly. She cried. She begged. Mrs. Kellerman said it was for the best. Better life in a fine house than mucking stalls. Silas read the document 3 times, memorizing every word. His daughter sold like livestock. A price negotiated, a signature exchanged. All legal, all documented, all monstrous. Did she— His voice broke. Did she know about me? Did she know I was looking? Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. She talked about you. About her papa, who taught her to read tracts. She said you were away on a job when the bad men came. She hoped you would find her. She waited. The words nearly destroyed him. While he'd searched in all the wrong places, asked all the wrong questions, followed all the wrong trails, she'd been here, waiting, hoping, believing he would come. And then she'd been sold before he found her. I should have been there, he said. The guilt he'd carried for 15 years, crushing down with renewed force. I should have protected them. You could not have known. Mrs. Chen's voice was firm. The raiders chose their moment. This is their crime, not yours. But I could have found her sooner, before she was sold. Before you found her now, Mrs. Chen interrupted. That is what matters. Silas looked at the note again. Denver, a man named Beaumont. A household that employed trafficked children. What do you know about this Beaumont? Railroad money. Owned properties throughout Colorado. Reputation as respectable, but rumors of cruelty to staff. Mrs. Chen hesitated. His household employed several placed children over the years. Always young, always bought from operations like Kellerman's. A customer, Silas said, understanding. Part of a system. Kellerman supplied, Beaumont bought, and others like him. This wasn't isolated. This was business. Mrs. Chen reached across the table, touched his hand. But Mr. Ward, I saw your daughter 3 years ago, in Denver, at a mercantile. She was alive, hope and terror warred in his chest. You're certain? She was older, looked tired, but I recognized her. I started to approach, but she looked— Mrs. Chen paused. She looked like she did not want to be recognized. So I honored that. I prayed someone would come looking properly. I prayed it would be you. Silas copied the Denver address carefully into his own notebook. Beaumont J. Beaumont, Denver. He looked up. Mrs. Chen, why did you keep this document? Why risk it? Because some crimes should not disappear, she replied simply. Because children matter. Because fathers search. He wanted to pay her, to offer something for this gift of information. She refused absolutely. Bring her home. That is payment enough. Outside, Silas stood in the harsh sunlight, the promissory note folded carefully in his pocket next to the music box. Echo waited patiently, and Silas stroked the donkey's neck with shaking hands. Denver, he said aloud. 2 weeks' ride, maybe more. But that's where the trail leads. He had a name now, had an address, had confirmation Sarah had lived to at least 15, had been seen alive at 20. The gaps were narrowing. The trail was warming. That night, preparing for the long journey north, Silas felt something he'd thought long dead. Determination mixed with possibility. Not hope, he wouldn't call it that, wouldn't tempt fate with such presumption. But something close, something that let him breathe a little easier despite the rage coiled in his gut. Sarah had been sold, trafficked, used, but she'd survived. And survivors could be found. He packed carefully, supplies for 2 weeks, the music box, the halter, the promissory note, evidence and talismans and proof. Tomorrow he'd start north. Tomorrow the trail would continue, and somewhere in Denver, answers waited. 1 week into the journey north, Silas and Echo reached Las Animas, a way station town that existed primarily to serve travelers passing through. Telegraph office, general store, saloon, hotel, the essentials of frontier commerce arranged around a dusty plaza. Silas stopped to rest, echo, and resupply, stretching his dwindling funds as far as they'd go. The telegraph operator, Miss Abernathy, looked up as he entered. She was a woman in her 50s, efficient and no-nonsense, the kind who'd seen everything and was surprised by nothing. "Help you?" "Just passing through," Silas replied. "Wondered if there's a message board. Anyone looking for work? Not much call for labor this time of year." She paused, studying a paper on her desk. "You wouldn't be Silas Ward, would you?" He froze. "I am. Why?"
"Got a wire for you."
"Came in yesterday from Socorro." She handed him the telegram. Watching with open curiosity, Silas unfolded the paper with careful hands. Read the typed words that would redirect everything. Stop. Beaumont dead. 6 months. House sold. Check Colorado Women's Refuge. Denver. Sarah used different names. Sarah Kellerman. Stop. Pritchard. He read it twice. Then a third time, each word landing like a physical blow. Beaumont dead. 6 months ago. No confrontation possible. No justice to be served. The man who'd bought his daughter was beyond reach, beyond accountability, beyond anything Silas could do to him. But Sarah, using the name Kellerman, not Ward, her captor's name instead of her father's. Bad news. Miss Abernathy asked. Mixed, Silas managed. He paid for a reply. Received. Proceeding to refuge. Thank you, stop. Outside, he sat on a bench in the plaza, Echo grazing nearby, trying to process this new information. Beaumont's death removed the clear target of his rage, but also eliminated the most direct path to Sarah. The house sold meant whatever household she'd been part of was dispersed. She could be anywhere, except she wasn't anywhere. She was at a refuge, a place that helped women escaping bad situations, which meant she'd escaped, which meant she'd survived not just the trafficking, but also whatever had happened in Beaumont's household. But the name, Sarah Kellerman. She'd taken the name of the people who'd held her at the ranch, the people who'd sold her. Why, did she not remember Ward? Not remember him? The possibility carved a hole in his chest. 15 years was a long time. She'd been 8 when taken. Memories from childhood could fade, especially memories trauma wanted to erase. Maybe she didn't remember a father who taught her to track, a mother who sang her to sleep, a home where she'd been loved. Or maybe, and this was worse, maybe she remembered but chose Kellerman because Ward meant nothing good. Ward meant the family who couldn't protect her. The father who wasn't there when raiders came. The life that ended in fire and screaming. Echo nuzzled his shoulder, and Silas stroked the donkey's face absently. She doesn't use my name anymore, he said quietly. I don't know if that's because she forgot, or because she's trying to. The journey to Denver required another week minimum. Colorado Women's Refuge. He'd heard of such places. Charities that took in fallen women, orphans, those with nowhere else to go. They provided shelter and work in exchange for reformed behavior and Christian devotion. Some were genuine havens. Others were barely better than prisons with crosses. He'd find out which kind when he arrived. The afternoon brought another telegram. This one forwarded from Dry River, Doc Merriweather writing, Ruth Callahan gravely ill. As for you, Silas stood in the telegraph office, reading the words repeatedly. Ruth, who'd given him money for this journey. Ruth, who'd shown him kindness when he'd been nothing but a ghost haunting their town's edges. She was dying, and she'd asked for him. Dry River was 3 days back. Denver was 1 week ahead. Ruth was dying now. Sarah was settled at the refuge, probably had been there months, maybe longer. The decision should have been obvious, return to honor the woman who'd helped him. But 15 years of searching, 15 years of nothing, and now he was close, so desperately close. To turn back now, when Sarah's location was known. He thought of Elena, wondered what she'd say. Elena, who'd valued loyalty above almost everything, who'd taught Sarah to honor commitments and treat kindness with respect. He thought of Sarah herself, wondered what woman she'd become. Would she respect a father who abandoned dying friends? Would she want to know a man who'd choose his own needs over others' suffering? The answer was clear, even if it hurt. Silas composed a telegram to Doc. Will return after Denver. Tell Ruth I'm sorry. Finding Sarah for her. Stop. He sent it, hating himself for the choice but unable to make another. Ruth would understand, he told himself. She'd sent him on this journey. She'd want him to finish it. But the guilt sat heavy as he left the telegraph office, heavy as he packed his supplies, heavy as he and Echo continued north toward Denver. That evening brought another blow. In the saloon, 2 men discussed Denver news over drinks, and Silas listened from the bar's far corner, invisible as always. Refuge is closing, you hear? One said, which refuge? Colorado Women's Refuge. Funding got pulled. Building's been sold to developers. They're relocating the women to different charities across the state. When? 10 days from now, maybe less. Silas set down his whiskey with careful hands, fighting the urge to interrupt and demand details. Instead, he listened as the men continued, gathering fragments, money troubles, scandal over mismanagement, property too valuable to waste on charity, women being sent to facilities in Colorado Springs, Pueblo, Boulder. 10 days. He had 10 days to reach Denver before Sarah could be sent anywhere. 10 days before the trail scattered again, Echo couldn't handle the pace required. The donkey's leg had worsened with steady travel, the joints swelling despite rest stops and careful treatment. To push hard now might cripple the animal permanently. Another impossible choice, Echo's welfare or Sarah's accessibility. Silas stepped outside, breathed the cold night air, and tried to think clearly. He could abandon Echo here, buy a horse, ride hard. But Echo had brought him this far, had been the key that unlocked every door. Leaving the donkey felt like betrayal, and worse, felt like tempting whatever fate had been guiding this search. Compromise, then. He'd push through nights, cover more miles, but carefully. Less sleep for himself, more vigilance about Echo's condition. They'd make it work. They had to. He returned to the stable, checked Echo's leg again. The swelling was significant but not catastrophic. With daily cold compresses and reduced daily mileage, they might manage. "One more push, friend," Silas said, stroking Echo's neck. "Just one more. Get me to Denver, and I swear you'll rest for a month." Echo huffed softly, trusting. That night Silas barely slept. His mind circled the same facts obsessively. Beaumont dead, Sarah alive, refuge closing, time running short. And beneath it all, the name Sarah Kellerman. His daughter carrying someone else's identity. He pulled out the music box, held it in the darkness. Still broken, still silent. But he'd promised himself he'd fix it once he found Sarah. They'd fix it together, maybe. If she wanted anything to do with him, if she remembered him at all. "Sarah Kellerman," he whispered to the darkness. "My daughter has another name." The words felt like loss and discovery tangled together. She'd survived, transformed, become someone new. The girl he remembered was gone, had been gone for 15 years. In her place was a woman he'd never met, carrying a name that wasn't his, living a life he knew nothing about. Would she want to see him? Would she care that he'd searched? Would she blame him for not finding her sooner, for not protecting her in the first place? The questions had no answers, but dawn would come regardless, and with dawn the need to move. 10 days to Denver. 10 days to find his daughter before she vanished again into the vastness of a country that swallowed people whole. Silas packed his bedroll in darkness, woke the stable keeper to settle accounts, and led Echo into the pre-dawn cold. Stars overhead, road beneath, miles ahead. The same elements that had defined the past 15 years, but now urgency replaced despair. She was close. Finally, impossibly close, and he'd find her or die trying. 10 days of relentless travel brought them to Denver's outskirts, both man and donkey showing the strain. Silas had pushed through nights when the moon was bright enough to see the trail, rested only when Echo's limp grew pronounced enough to threaten permanent damage. They arrived exhausted, filthy, operating on determination more than strength. Denver in 1892 was a booming city, nothing like the frontier settlements Silas knew. Trolley cars clanged down paved streets. Electric lights illuminated storefronts. Crowds moved with urban purpose, everyone busy, everyone belonging to this world of commerce and civilization. Silas felt profoundly out of place, a scarred ghost from another era, stumbling into modernity. First priority was Echo. The liveryman took one look at the donkey and shook his head. "This animal needs rest more than a month." "He'll get it," Silas promised, paying for extended care with money he couldn't really spare. "Best feed, gentle treatment. I'll be back for him." Echo's eyes seemed to understand. This was the end of their shared journey. The donkey had brought him here, fulfilled whatever purpose fate had assigned. Silas pressed his forehead to Echo's and whispered, "Thank you for everything." The Colorado Women's Refuge occupied a large brick building downtown, respectable but worn, with a sign out front reading, "Closing November 30th, final week." 4 days left. Silas had arrived with time to spare but barely. The front door was answered by a stern-looking matron in her 50s, Mrs. Howell, who regarded Silas's trail-worn appearance with evident skepticism. "We're not taking residents. We're closing. I'm not here for residents," Silas said, holding his hat. "I'm looking for my daughter, Sarah." "Every man claims to be someone's father," Mrs. Howell replied, starting to close the door. "Wait." Silas pulled out the music box, the halter, the promissory note. "She was taken from me 15 years ago, sold to a man named Beaumont. I've tracked her from New Mexico to here. Please, just tell me if she was here." Mrs. Howell examined the items, her expression softening slightly. She looked at his scarred face, his desperate eyes, and something in her relented. "Wait here." She left him standing in the foyer, a room with worn furniture, religious tracts on a table, the smell of lye soap and institutional cooking. Other women passed through, giving him wide berth, their eyes carrying the wariness of those who'd learned to distrust male presence. Silas understood. He made himself small, unthreading, trying to project harmlessness. 20 minutes passed before Mrs. Howell returned carrying a ledger. She opened it, showed him an entry halfway down a page. "There was a Sarah Kellerman here, past tense, struck like a fist to the gut. She left? 3 months ago, relief and frustration tangled together. Alive 3 months ago. But gone now. Where did she go?" Mrs. Howell studied him carefully, weighing whether to trust this information to a stranger. Then she turned the ledger so he could read, "Sarah Kellerman, age 19 at intake, domestic service background, literate, skilled in cooking and sewing. Reason for admittance: escaped abusive household after employer's death, no family. Recommendation: placement with suitable family." The words, "no family," felt like a knife between his ribs. She'd believed herself alone. While he searched, she'd believed herself abandoned. "She was here 4 years, Mrs. Howell said quietly. "Came to us after Beaumont died and his household was dissolved. She had nowhere to go, no resources, no connections. We took her in. What was she like?" Silas needed to know, needed to understand who his daughter had become. Mrs. Howell's expression warmed. "Kind, especially with the children. She worked in our kitchen, helped younger women adjust to life here. Very patient, very gentle. And sad, always sad, even when she smiled." The description created an image, a woman carrying grief, showing kindness despite her own pain. Sarah had survived, but survival had marked her. 3 months ago, Mrs. Howell continued, a letter arrived from New Mexico Territory. A woman named Teresa Sandoval wrote requesting Sarah by name. Said she'd known Sarah's mother years ago. Offered her a home, work at a ranch, family environment. Teresa Sandoval. The name registered immediately. Elena's childhood friend, the one she'd mentioned occasionally with affection. They'd lost touch when Teresa married a rancher and moved away, but Elena had spoken of her fondly. Teresa knew Elena, Silas said, the pieces connecting. She was my wife's friend. Then you understand why Sarah trusted the offer. Mrs. Sandoval's letter was kind, detailed, promised safety. And Sarah was desperate. We were closing. She needed somewhere to go, and the idea of connecting with someone who'd known her mother. "Where?" Silas interrupted. "Where did she go?" "Sandoval Ranch, 20 miles south of Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory, near where this entire search had begun, near the land where Elena was buried. The trail had circled back, bringing Sarah home to territory she'd been taken from. She left with a letter of introduction and a small amount of money," Mrs. Howell added. "We were sorry to see her go. She'd become part of our community. Did she?" Silas had to ask, even though the answer might destroy him. "Did she mention her father? Did she know I was searching?" Mrs. Howell's hesitation told him everything. She believed her family was dead. In the years at Beaumont's household, she was told repeatedly that no one had survived the raid. By the time she came to us, she'd accepted it. They'd lied to her, kept her isolated, convinced her that she was alone. Another cruelty in a long line of cruelties. "May I see her belongings?" Silas asked. "You said she couldn't carry everything." Mrs. Howell led him to a storage room where a small wooden box sat labeled S. Kellerman. Inside, modest clothes. A worn Bible, letters from refuge residents thanking Sarah for various kindnesses, and at the bottom, carefully preserved, a child's drawing. Silas lifted it with trembling hands. Crayon on paper, faded with age. A stick-figure man, woman and child in front of a house, sun overhead. Child's handwriting at the bottom. My papa, my mama, me, Sarah. She looked at that drawing often, Mrs. Howell said softly. She remembered you, Mr. Ward. She just thought you were dead. The drawing went carefully into his pocket with the other treasures. Evidence that he'd been loved, that he'd been remembered, that his daughter had carried his memory through 15 years of hell. Thank you, he managed, for caring for her, for helping her. We tried. Mrs. Howell walked him back to the entrance. Mr. Ward, it's another long journey to Santa Fe, and she's settled there now, building a life. Are you sure I've come this far? Silas replied. I'm not stopping now. Outside, Denver's noise and motion felt overwhelming. Silas walked back to the livery, his mind already calculating routes and timelines. 2 weeks to Santa Fe, maybe 3 with Echo's condition. But the donkey had earned rest. Silas would buy a horse, ride fast, leave Echo here to recover and return for him later. The liveryman had better news than expected. The donkey of yours? The rest helped. Swelling's down. Might be able to travel in another week if you go slow. So Silas waited. Spent the week working odd jobs around Denver to earn a bit more money. Sleeping in cheap rooms, preparing for the final leg of this endless journey. He bought new clothes, not fancy but clean, and shaved carefully around his scars. He wanted to look like a father, not a ghost. At a general store, he purchased small gifts with money he couldn't spare. An embroidered handkerchief, hard candies, a tortoise-shell comb. Foolish perhaps, but fatherly instincts ran deep. He wanted to offer something, anything, to show that he'd thought of her, that he cared. The nights were hardest. Alone in his room, Silas studied the drawing by lamplight, memorizing every crayon line. He practiced words in the mirror, tried to imagine what he'd say when they finally met. Sarah, it's me. It's Papa. The words sounded wrong, inadequate after 15 years of absence. What did you say to a daughter you hadn't seen since childhood? How did you explain why you'd failed to protect her, failed to find her sooner, failed at everything that mattered? He'd let her lead, he decided. Let her set the terms of reunion. If she wanted distance, he'd give it. If she wanted nothing to do with him, he'd accept it. Just knowing she was alive and safe would have to be enough. The music box sat on the table, still broken. When I find her, he told it, maybe we'll fix you together. On the 7th day, the liveryman declared Echo fit for slow travel. Take your time. Walk him more than you ride. Stop if the limp returns. Silas agreed to all terms, grateful that Echo could finish this journey with him. They'd started together. The donkey's brand had unlocked everything, and they'd finished together. The morning of departure, Silas stood in his hotel room with all his meager possessions packed. Clothes, supplies, the music box, the halter, the promissory note, the drawing. Evidence of a life shattered and a search sustained. Evidence of love that hadn't died despite everything. One more ride, he said to his reflection. 2 weeks to Sarah, 2 weeks to find out if she'll forgive me. The man in the mirror looked back, scarred, aging, worn down by years of loss. But his eyes held something new, not quite hope, not quite peace, but determination mixed with acceptance. Whatever happened when he found Sarah, at least he'd know. At least the searching would be over. He picked up his pack, settled his hat, and headed downstairs where Echo waited. Denver's streets bustled with morning activity as they walked through, heading south, heading home, heading toward the daughter who'd become a stranger, heading toward whatever ending this story would have. 2 weeks of careful travel brought them to New Mexico territory, the landscape shifting from Colorado's mountains to high desert plains. Silas knew intimately. This was the land where he'd built his life with Elena, where Sarah had been born, where everything had ended in fire and loss. Coming back felt like returning to a grave. The Sandoval Ranch sat 20 miles south of Santa Fe, nestled in rolling hills where grass grew thick enough to support good cattle. Late afternoon sun painted everything gold as Silas and Echo approached the gate. The property was well maintained. Main house in good repair, barn and corrals showing signs of prosperity without ostentation. A working ranch, successful but not showy. Silas dismounted at the gate, his heart hammering so hard he felt dizzy. Somewhere behind those walls, his daughter lived. Somewhere in that house or barn or yard, Sarah existed, alive, adult, real. A woman emerged from the main house before he could decide whether to call out or simply wait. She was in her mid-50s, strong-featured with greying hair pulled back, her face weathered by sun and years but kind. She studied him from the porch and recognition dawned slowly. "Silas Ward," Teresa Sandoval said, her voice gentle. "It wasn't a question. You know me? I've been expecting you for 15 years. She descended the porch steps, approached without fear or hesitation. "You look like Elena described, the eyes especially. And the scars are new, but grief isn't. You were her friend, her best friend once. Before life took us different directions." Teresa gestured toward the porch. "Come, sit. You look like you could use water and rest." Silas followed, legs unsteady. Teresa brought a pitcher and cups, poured water with steady hands while he tried to find words. "Elena," he managed finally. "You knew about—" "I learned of the raid months after it happened. I sent men to search your property to see if anyone had survived." Teresa's face was sad. "They found her grave, and 2 raiders' bodies. Someone had buried her properly, put up a marker. Neighbors," Silas said. "I was away, came back too late. I took something from her grave." Teresa reached into her pocket, produced a gold band. "Her wedding ring. I kept it safe, hoping I'd find family to return it to." Silas's hands shook as he accepted the ring, thin gold, worn smooth by years of wear, the inside engraved with their wedding date. He'd put this on Elena's finger the day they married, 17 years ago now. She'd never taken it off. "Thank you," he whispered, "for protecting her, for remembering." "I never stopped remembering." Teresa refilled his cup. "When I saw the name Sarah Kellerman in the Denver refugees' placement notices, I investigated. The age matched, the description matched, the history of coming from New Mexico matched. I reached out, hoping, praying it was Elena's daughter." "It is," Silas confirmed. "It's Sarah. I know." "She's here," Teresa paused. "She doesn't know you're coming." His breath caught. "Does she know about me? That I'm alive?" "I told her everything. About you and Elena, about the searching, about how you never stopped looking." Teresa's expression was complicated. "She didn't believe at first. Thought you were dead. Thought I was mistaken or lying. But I convinced her it was possible you still lived, still searched." "Where is she?" "In the barn with the horses." Teresa pointed to the structure 100 yards away. "She works there most afternoons. Finds peace with the animals." Silas stood, swaying slightly. Between him and his daughter, 100 yards. Between him and 15 years of grief, less than a minute's walk. "Silas," Teresa said gently. "She's afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid you won't want her. Afraid she'll disappoint you. Afraid of what she's become after everything she endured." Teresa's voice was firm. "You need to understand. She's been through things no child should survive. She's strong, but she's also fragile in ways you can't see. Be gentle. I just want to see her," Silas said, his voice breaking. "Just want to know she's real. She's real. She's wonderful. And she's been waiting for someone to claim her for 15 years. Teresa touched his arm. "Go to her." "But Silas, she's not the child you remember. She's a woman now with her own history and scars. Love the person she is, not the memory of who she was." Silas nodded, understanding. He descended the porch steps, Echo following at his shoulder. Across the yard, the barn waited. Inside, his daughter. Inside, the end of 15 years of searching. He took a breath, squared his shoulders, and started walking. Each step felt momentous and terrifying. Each step brought him closer to either redemption or rejection. Teresa called after him, "Silas, she's stronger than you think." She survived. "That counts for everything." He raised a hand in acknowledgement, kept walking. The barn door stood open, sunlight streaming through. Inside, someone spoke softly to a horse. A voice he'd last heard at age 8, now adult, now changed by time and trauma. Sarah's voice, his daughter, alive. Silas approached the barn entrance slowly, each step deliberate. His heart thundered so loudly he was certain everyone in New Mexico could hear it. Echo stayed close, the donkey's presence a comfort and a connection to how this all began. Inside the barn, sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof boards, creating columns of dusty gold. The smell was familiar: hay, leather, horses, earth. The smell of honest work and animal care. Someone spoke in a low voice near the back stalls. "You're a good girl, aren't you? Patient and kind, just like you should be." Silas moved forward until he could see her. A young woman with dark hair in a braid, wearing a simple work dress, brushing a chestnut mare with careful strokes. Her profile was Elena's exactly, the same line of jaw, the same slope of nose. But when she turned slightly, Silas saw his own eyes looking back, the same grey he'd passed to his daughter 23 years ago. She was beautiful, and she was a stranger. For a long moment he simply stood there, unable to move or speak. This was Sarah, his daughter, the child he'd searched for through 15 years of desperate seeking. And she was here, alive, real, close enough to touch. Echo shifted beside him, hooves scraping the barn floor. Sarah heard the sound and turned, her hand dropping to her side, the brush forgotten. She froze. Their eyes met across the distance. Recognition dawned slowly in her expression, not of him specifically, but of what he represented. A scarred man in the doorway, weathered by sun and years, looking at her with desperate intensity. Her lips moved. One word, barely audible. "Papa?" The question in it nearly broke him. She wasn't sure. After everything, she still wasn't certain he'd come. Silas nodded, unable to force words past the tightness in his throat. "Is it really you?" Sarah's voice was stronger now, but trembling. "It's me," he managed, his voice rough from emotion. "Sarah, my girl, my Sarah." She took a step forward, then another, then suddenly she was running the final distance. She crashed into him with force that nearly knocked him over, her arms wrapping around his chest, her face pressed against his shoulder. She was sobbing, great, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Silas held her, his own tears flowing freely. He pressed his scarred face to her hair, breathed in the scent of her, sun and hay and something essentially her. His arms folded around her carefully, afraid she might break, afraid this moment might dissolve like so many dreams before. "I thought you were dead," she cried against him. "They told me you were dead. They said no one was looking. I never stopped," Silas choked out. "Never stopped searching. 15 years, every day I never stopped. I waited. When I was small, I waited every day for you to come. And then," her voice broke, "then I stopped believing. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. Sorry I couldn't protect you and your mama. Sorry it took so long. You're here now." Sarah pulled back to look at his face, her hands rising to trace the scars with gentle fingers. "You're hurt. Old wounds," he said, just as he'd imagined saying. "They don't matter. Everything matters." She studied him intently, memorizing features, confirming reality. "Teresa told me you might come. Told me about Mama, about the fire, about everything. I didn't believe her. Couldn't let myself believe. I have so much to tell you. So much to explain." "Later," Sarah interrupted. "Right now, just let me see you. Let me know you're real." They stood together in the barn, holding each other while horses moved quietly in their stalls, and dust motes danced in sunlight. The weight of 15 years pressed down, but also lifted away, replaced by presence, by connection, by the miracle of finding what had been lost. Eventually they sat in the hay, still holding hands, and talked. Sarah told her story, the raid, the terror, the years at Kellerman's ranch, being sold to Beaumont, the refuge, finally arriving here. She spoke carefully, editing the worst parts. But Silas heard what she didn't say in the pauses and catch of her breath. Silas told his story, the searching, the dead ends, finding Echo with the brand, following every trail to this moment. He showed her the halter, the music box, the drawing she'd made as a child. "I kept that," Sarah whispered, touching the drawing. "All those years, I kept it, and I kept this." Silas pulled out the music box. "It's broken. Has been since I was taken," Sarah finished. She took the box, wound it, and to both their shock, a hesitant melody emerged. The mechanism caught and skipped but played. "I fixed it," she said softly. "Months ago. Teresa gave it to me and I spent weeks repairing it." "You fixed it," Silas repeated, the symbolism overwhelming. "We can fix things, Papa," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "We can start again. It won't be what it was, but it can be something new. Something good. I want that more than anything." "Then stay," Sarah said simply. "Stay with me. We'll figure out the rest together." Echo appeared at the barn entrance, silhouetted in afternoon light. Sarah saw him, and recognition sparked in her eyes. "Echo, that's Echo." "You remember him?" "He was my friend," Sarah said, standing to approach the donkey. "At the ranch before everything else. He was mine." She stroked Echo's face, and the donkey nuzzled her with clear affection. "Connection complete, circle closed. He brought me to you," Silas said. "Then we owe him everything," Sarah replied. Tears and laughter mixing in her voice. Father and daughter stood with their old friend in the golden afternoon light. 3 survivors of the same trauma finally reunited. The path had been long and brutal, but it had ended here in peace, in presence, in the possibility of healing. 6 months passed like water finding its level, settling into patterns that felt both new and inevitable. Spring came to the Sandoval Ranch with wildflowers and new foals, the land renewing itself as all land does regardless of human pain. Silas Ward, who'd been silent for 15 years, found his voice again. Not the way it had been before. That man was gone, replaced by someone older and marked by loss, but a voice nonetheless. He spoke to Sarah over morning coffee, to Teresa about ranch work, to the horses he helped gentle. The words came slowly at first, rusty with disuse, but Sarah's patience made space for them. His scars faded, not the burns on his face. Those would remain until death, but the invisible wounds that had kept him frozen in grief. He still woke some mornings with Elena's absence sitting heavy on his chest, still felt the guilt of not being there when she needed him most. But Sarah's presence, her forgiveness, her determination to build forward rather than backward, gave him permission to exist beyond survival. Sarah thrived in ways that seemed miraculous until you understood that survival itself was the miracle. The nightmares came less frequently. The fear when men approached too quickly, too loudly, didn't vanish but became manageable. She'd learned to trust her own strength, to believe that her past didn't define her future. Teresa's unwavering support provided the foundation, but Sarah built the structure herself. Each day a choice to heal, to grow, to become more than what trauma had tried to make her. Teresa remained the anchor, the matriarch who'd orchestrated this reunion and now presided over their found family with quiet competence. She shared stories of Eleanor that Sarah couldn't remember, kept Eleanor's memory alive without letting it become a shrine. The 3 of them, Silas, Sarah, Teresa, formed something that looked like family from the outside and felt like family from within. Echo recovered completely, his limp disappearing with rest and proper care. He lived in the barn's most comfortable stall, treated like the hero he was, occasionally carrying Sarah on rides through the hills, but mostly existing in deserved leisure. The donkey seemed content, as if he'd fulfilled some destiny and could now simply be. Silas worked the ranch alongside the hired hands, discovering he was good with horses, particularly injured or traumatized ones. His patience, honed by 15 years of relentless searching, translated well to animal healing. He developed a reputation in the region. If you had a horse others had given up on, bring it to Ward. He might work miracles. The work satisfied something in him. Healing animals couldn't erase his failure to protect his family, but it offered a form of atonement. Each horse gentled, each wound mended, each frightened creature calmed, felt like a small redemption. Sarah and Teresa ran the household together, their partnership evolving into something deeper than employer and employee. Teresa taught Sarah ranch management, shared her knowledge of the land and livestock and business. Sarah brought youth and energy, new ideas and different perspectives. They became colleagues and friends, bound by shared loss and mutual respect. On a warm spring day, a traveling photographer passed through offering his services. Teresa suggested they commission a portrait, documentation of their family, proof of survival and reunion. They arranged themselves outside the main house. Silas, Sarah, Teresa, and Echo, who'd been led from the barn for the occasion. "Smile," the photographer said, adjusting his camera. "This is for posterity." The resulting photograph captured them as they were. Silas, with his scars visible, but his eyes at peace. Sarah, with her hand on Echo's shoulder. Teresa standing slightly apart, but clearly part of the whole. They looked like what they were. Survivors who'd found each other. Broken pieces that fit together despite irregular edges. When the photograph arrived a week later, they studied it together in the evening lamplight. Sarah traced the figures with one finger. "We look like a family." "We are a family," Silas confirmed. "Not the one you started with," Teresa added, "but the one you built." Elena's wedding ring lived on Sarah's finger now, worn as tribute to the mother she barely remembered but honored deeply. Silas had given it freely, recognizing that Eleanor's legacy belonged with her daughter. Sarah wore it alongside a ring Teresa had given her, symbolic of chosen family, of bonds forged by intention rather than blood. Their conversations turned increasingly to the future, to what came next, beyond simple survival. Sarah wanted to help other survivors, women escaping situations like hers, children lost in systems designed to exploit rather than protect. Teresa supported the idea immediately. The ranch could be a refuge, a safe place for those with nowhere else to turn. "We'd need to be careful," Teresa cautioned. "Legal, documented beyond reproach." "But it's possible," Sarah insisted. "We have space, resources, experience. We could make a difference." Silas offered his contribution. "I can find them. Track leads, follow trails, bring them to safety. Using his searching skills for others' reunions, turning his obsession into service. I know how to look for the lost." The plan took shape slowly. Sandoval Ranch's sanctuary, word spreading quietly through networks of those who helped rather than hurt. They'd start small, maybe one or two people, build carefully. Their story would become a beacon, proof that recovery was possible, that families could be found or formed, that trauma didn't have to be terminal. One evening, Silas and Sarah sat on the porch while Teresa cleaned inside. The music box rested on the railing between them, playing its melody into the gathering dusk. Fixed now, functional, the dancing horse spinning as it had when Sarah was 6 years old. "Tell me about Mama," Sarah said, not for the first time. "Tell me something you haven't told me before," Silas thought, remembering. She used to sing while cooking. Off-key, ridiculous songs she'd make up about whatever she was preparing. The mule would hear her from the corral and start braying along, which made her laugh so hard she'd have to sit down. Sarah smiled, storing the memory like treasure. "She sounds wonderful." She was. "She'd be proud of you, of who you've become." "And of you," Sarah replied. "You never gave up." They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge. The same stars that had witnessed Silas's despair now watched his peace. The same landscape that had held his tragedy now cradled his healing. Inside, Teresa began humming, Elena's melody, passed down through memory and love. Echo dozed in his stall, content. The music box played on, its mechanism restored, its purpose renewed. "We're going to be all right," Sarah said, more statement than question. "We are," Silas agreed. "We already are." The wounded donkey had led him home. The broken music box played again. The lost daughter was found. Not everything could be healed, but enough could be repaired that life felt worth living again. And that, after 15 years of searching, was more grace than Silas Ward had ever expected to receive.